Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Readsy. So today we're going to be talking about foreshadowing. So what is foreshadowing? It's a term you've likely heard before. Essentially, it's planting hints or kind of hidden setup in order to set up for plot twists or plot reveals later in the story. When done well, it kind of creates that, oh my god, how did I not see this coming effect when the plot twist finally happens. But if not done properly, then a plot twist or reveal can go from something that makes a book and becomes something that falls really flat because it didn't feel properly set up. Foreshadowing is like invisible setup. It's setup that the reader doesn't notice is happening until that moment the pieces all fit together. So when do you need to use foreshadowing? I think it's important to remember that you don't need to foreshadow everything in your story. You do not need to foreshadow logical plot developments that are just natural developments of the story, that are just kind of logical developments of your story's plot, or anything already set up by, the concept or premise. In Lord of the Rings, there doesn't need to be any foreshadowing that eventually Sam and Frodo are going to get to Mordor, because that's the concept of the plot. That's the whole goal of the story. That's what everything is leading towards. We don't need to foreshadow that. But we do need to foreshadow things that are plot twists, big reveals, things that go against information that has already been set up, or are counter to the story's, logical, natural progression. So let's talk about a couple foreshadowing techniques that you can use to actually implement foreshadowing into your writing. I feel like that's the tricky thing with short foreshadowing. It's pretty obvious what it is, but the idea of how to actually implement it skillfully can seem a bit overwhelming. One really great foreshadowing technique is to think about readers' assumptions and what assumptions they will make and how you can play with those assumptions. If you give readers a piece of information, but you don't give them the full context, what will they assume and how is that assumption different from the truth? This way, you're actually showing them the truth. They just don't realize it. When you give them the full picture, they'll realize what was actually going on. This is a great way to foreshadow if you have information that is at play and actually affecting the story, but the reader and potentially the characters just don't know it yet. You can also use the omniscience or retrospection of your narrator. If you have a narrator who knows more than the reader, whether they're an omniscient narrator or a retrospective narrator, that is a narrator who has already experienced the story and is telling it after the fact, you can use their larger scope of the story to do a bit of foreshadowing by having the narrator hint at what's going to happen later, but still kind of coyly withhold that information. You could also try using a Chekhov's gun. You've probably heard this term before. It's a pretty simple device. It's basically the idea that if you introduce a gun in the first act, that gun needs to be fired in the third act. Sometimes a Chekhov's gun is a lot subtler. A gun is a pretty obvious object to introduce into a story, but sometimes Chekhov's guns are really subtle to the point that we don't actually notice that it's something that needs to be fired later until it actually happens. So introducing these elements that are going to come into play in your plot twist later on, introducing them in the beginning is a great way to kind of lay that setup without the reader maybe even realizing what you're doing. You can also just think about very subtle details, things that the reader likely won't pick up on in the moment. A lot of the time, foreshadowing is very subtle. It's these tiny little details that don't really seem important in the moment, so we don't really register that setup is happening, but it's only after the fact that we can look back and see that all those subtle details were actually of great importance. And when using that kind of subtlety, you can think about creating diversions, much like a magician would create a diversion so we don't really realize what's going on in the trick. You can do that in your writing by presenting these details, maybe subtle things, in moments where the reader is paying more attention to something else. You're kind of distracting them with something that seems more shiny and more important, while also laying the foundation and presenting information that's going to set up for your plot twist later on. So those are a few ways that you can integrate foreshadowing into your work. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the Google form linked in the description and they might be answered in an upcoming Q&A. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Friday on this channel. Until next time, bye.